All right, so hello everyone. Um, I'll quickly start by introducing myself for those who don't know me. My name is Sara, I am 21 and I'm currently a master's student at the Conflict and Development Studies program at Ghent University. I'm also a member of Orbis, a student-led association for youths that aims at diffusing international relations in an accessible and fun way to engage people in this very interesting subject. So I would like to thank everyone for being here for this first webinar of the association about the world before and after COVID-19 with our very special guest, Professor Gardini, whom I thank so much for accepting our invitation to be here. And this is going to be divided in two parts. So firstly, I'll ask a couple of questions to the professor, and I will urge you to put some questions in the chat that then we will answer after our talk and open up the floor to you guys as well. All right, so I'll maybe jump to our first topic / question, which is what led you, Professor, to write, edit a book such as this one? Why do you consider the subject important?
Hello, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you, and I would like to thank Sarah and Diogo for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to share with you some ideas about COVID-19 and also to take advantage of this meeting and this conversation to promote the book further. Well, how the book was born is very easily said. During the lockdown, I have to confess I went through very difficult times for the probably first week or 10 days. You know, this sensation that you feel a little bit displaced from your usual life. You have to find a new routine for yourself. And after watching a few movies, after trying to do some work from remote, I started thinking, you know, when big things happen to you, and not necessarily good or positive things, but in general, when big things happen to you, you can react in two ways. You can either spend your time moaning and how this is terrible and how unlucky I am, how unfortunate this whole thing is, and you would basically sink, slowly sink. Or you can get a grip and react, put some force, put some effort in your reaction and try to make the best out of the situation. So the first input to this book was to try and transmit to all the readers a positive message in two respects. The first one is a call to individual and collective responsibility. How the pandemic will evolve, how the pandemic will affect each and all of us is not predetermined. It is for us to decide. It is our behavior that will make the pandemic relatively quickly defeated. It is our behavior that will allow us to cope with the situation or not to cope with the situation. But the second positive aspect is that, like all crises, a crisis could be a challenge, but also an opportunity. And during the lockdown, we at least had the opportunity to think. And there is a very interesting, set of articles and books already available on the topic, but very few people actually stress this point. The world we have constructed, which is actually a good world. I mean, the world has never been better at any point in history. Okay, we've never been so well educated, so healthy, so rich, so well traveled, so aware of all the problems we have in this place. The role of women, the environment, nuclear threat. So we're very much aware. But the way in which we have organized this world has not only allowed a lot of progress in many spheres of human activity, but it has also allowed a virus to attack us. So we are so interconnected that we can exchange goods, we can exchange services, we can exchange ideas. That's what we're doing now. We can travel everywhere, but that also means that threats can travel everywhere. So the idea that the lockdown gave us some time to think how and why we were left exposed to a virus. Because a pandemic is not a new threat. We have had many pandemics in the course of history. But this specific one is entirely new. We shouldn't forget that. At the beginning, at the first outbreak, we didn't know much about this virus. So it was impossible, if you want, to start writing medical books about the virus. But it was possible to start writing books that invited everybody to reflection. And that was the first purpose of the book. None of the contributing experts, except 3 of them, but all the others are not expert in medical or biological issues. We are all more or less connected to the world of international relations, international politics, international economics, and diplomacy. So our purpose was to provide people with a very deep reflection. So this is not an academic exercise. This book is the result of an intellectual exercise of some 25 contributors who really wanted to share their knowledge in their specific area of expertise, trying to assess what the impact of the coronavirus could have been in that specific area, and what could we have done better to deal with the virus at the time of the pandemic, and what we could have possibly done better for the future. Let me give you an historical example. The United Nations, that it is very much criticized these days, is in fact not a bad organization at all. But in particular, the United Nations had a great advantage at the time when it was created. It was created during the war. That means the UN could capitalize on the wartime alliance that had not happened, for instance, for the League of Nations 20 years before. Our idea was more or less the same. So it is precisely during the pandemic, when the urgency to find solution is at its highest, that we should start reflection about what we can do better. Because later on, if we ever go back to a sort of normality, we will be so busy with our day-to-day routine that we will forget to plan for the future, how we can be more resilient. So the purpose of the book is really to stimulate a reflection. It was to stimulate a reflection during the COVID-19, but also in the times immediately after that. And the overall purpose was to develop a positive, constructive discussion with a holistic approach, meaning we cannot understand the COVID only as a biological phenomenon, because it is not. It's not just a medical thing. It affects all areas of human activity, from the economy to politics to the way in which we socialize with our friends. I guess none of you, certainly I never greeted my friends with a elbow. What a silly thing to do, but we now all, or most of us, do that. So it means if we want to understand this phenomenon and we want to react positively to it, we should think of an holistic, a global approach, which includes human beings, animals, other living creatures, vegetables too, because remember that the way in which the virus was generated was by a very unhealthy relations between animal and human beings in some Chinese markets in the province of Wuhan. So if we want to avoid these kind of things, we should really reconceptualize the way in which we live. And that's what we did try to do in this book, with specific reference to politics, diplomacy, and international economics, with the final section on medicine and biology, to have 3 experts in medical, not only physical medicine, but also mental, psychological, psychiatrist, medicine, and biology, to tell us what the impact from the medical perspective this whole thing can have on our society and the way in which we organize it.
Thank you, Professor. On that note, I would ask you then to help us, well, if you could elaborate on what the experts that collaborated with you on your book, how do they feel that COVID-19 will impact health governance as a whole?
Yeah. I mean, if we talk about governance, I think that COVID is just one factor of impact. And here, the real question is not whether or not COVID will have an impact, because that's for sure. A book published by Frank Snowden in 2019, so 1 year before the outbreak of COVID, was trying to recompile, if you want, all previous pandemics in history. And Snowden was able to demonstrate that all pandemics did cause major changes to the way in which we live and to the way in which we organize the international system. So the fact that COVID will affect us, will affect international relations, and will affect global governance is a fact. It's not speculation. The real question is how. And here we have 2 schools of thought, if you so wish. The first understands, and this is probably the majority of scholars from all disciplines, understands that COVID will just accelerate processes that were already in place. Whereas others are starting to wonder if COVID-19 will actually be a driver of change in the sense of the direction we will take. So not if we go slower or faster in the direction we have already taken, but if we are able to change the direction in which we are going, in which we are taking this world. So in this sense, what will be the impact on global governance? Well, it's extremely difficult to say that now, but we can already see some hints. For instance, some of you may have already come across a very interesting report produced in 2019 by the consulting company McKinsey. The title of this report is Globalization in Transition. Why is this interesting? Because this goes very much in line with the first approach to COVID. That is, COVID will accelerate what is already happening. And what is actually happening already? That globalization is changing. And how is globalization changing? Well, globalization is not going back. Globalization is not receding as someone would have it. So we are not de-globalizing the world. We're still very much into a process of globalization. So we produce more, we export more, but here is the trick. We export to shorter distances. So in a way, we are going back to a regional export strategy. We are going back to regional value chains rather than global, or at least we are shortening the distances of our export, we are shortening the length of our production chains. What does that mean? If you look at COVID, most countries have reacted by proposing a repatriation of production. So one country understands that it cannot be dependent on another country for essential productions, like medical equipment. So in a way, COVID will accelerate this process of shortening the distances to which we export or the distances from which we do import. It will also make it likely that we will turn more often to our allies, to those who are closer to us in terms of visions of the world, in terms of mentality. And if you want to think holistically, as we have tried to do in the book, this goes hand in hand with technological development. Technological development not only reduces distances, but actually is perfectly compatible with this idea that we don't go any further, but we come closer and closer. Typical example, 3D printing. What is 3D printing? It's a technology that we use to produce industrial products. So you don't assemble anymore, for instance, the wing of an airplane, but with a computer, you design it and print it directly as a finished piece and as a finished manufactured good through a 3D printing machine, a giant printer that prints in 3D. What does that mean? It means that you don't have transportation cost anymore. So where you design, where you conceive the idea, you can also produce. You don't need to externalize the production to China, to Laos, to Cambodia. So paradoxically, COVID will favor the developed nations and not the underdeveloped nations, whereas other driving forces of change like technology, they are supposed to help developing countries, but in fact, in conjunction with COVID, they may end up actually giving prejudice to developing country and restoring the centrality of those countries that already have good technology, good industrial capacity, and good economic reserves. So what does this tell us in terms of global governance? It very much depends on how the usual suspects will manage COVID-19 and will be able to come out of COVID-19. The United States has not performed very well for the time being, and the US has actually withdrawn from multinational cooperation of any sort. Europe, on the contrary, in spite of many different, sometimes diverging national responses, has tried to rally ranks and give a unified response. And I hope there will be a chance to return to this topic later, because the EU is actually a wonderful example of cooperation working. The EU response was not a failure, as someone argues, but it was a very successful, fast response that also displayed a lot of solidarity. China has initially quite badly reacted. As it is typical of Chinese politics, it was less than transparent, there was lack of communication, and there was a very unilateral way to deal with it. But when the proportion, the size of the pandemic proved to be so big that China itself could not deal with it, then the Chinese used the pandemic as a marketing tool to expand their influence, to use, for instance, the provision of masks and other medical supplies as a diplomatic instrument to extend their influence. By the way, nothing wrong with that. South Korea did exactly the same, and actually it did so more successfully than China, to be fair. The European Union using different instruments, but it has also used the pandemic to try and expand its reach. How? By making resources available to its partners. Over 3 billion euros for the Balkans, for instance, 900 million euros for Latin America, and many more for Africa, channeled through bilateral aid and through multilateral cooperation. So the impact on global governance has been at least diverse. We live in a moment of uncertainty, very deep and pervasive uncertainty, in which it is very difficult to give you predictions. However, one of the interesting parts of global governance will have to do with global health governance. And I hope that my host today, Sarah, will want to expand later on this topic, which I find extremely fascinating.
Yes, so I would like to probe a little bit deeper when you mentioned the EU and the different responses that we saw. So a bit of a disastrous beginning from China and then trying to ride the wave of shortage in supplies, and then the US being a bit of a chaotic situation. How do you see the future of multilateralism? Do you believe that, as you were saying about globalization, will it also shift towards more of a region-based cooperation, or do you see it staying more in a UN global aspiration type of cooperation?
Okay, I would need a crystal ball to answer this question. I would need to be a magician rather than a professor or a consultant. I think that your question implies a number of different issues, and you well captured the interplay between these different issues. But for the sake of analysis, let's try to unpack the question a little bit. So the first aspect that you mentioned, Sarah, thank you for that, is multilateralism. And again, of course, we have forces that were already at work even before COVID-19. How many times, especially those of you who are students or would-be scholar of international relations, international politics, international history or economics, have heard that multilateralism is in crisis? But is it really in crisis? Well, yes and no. It depends on how you look at it. Traditional Western liberal multilateralism is in crisis. There have been no reforms of the Security Council at the United Nations. The World Trade Organization is basically paralyzed. The IMF and the World Bank are losing credibility and legitimacy, and so do institutions such as the G7 or the G20. So in this sense, yes, the multilateralism to which we are used to is actually losing ground. But there is at least another multilateralism that is flourishing, and that is the multilateralism hinging around China. So if we look at what has happened in the last, say, 5 to 10 years, there is a very live and kicking organization in the sphere of security. That is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There are new multilateral forums in the political sphere. The China CELAC Forum between China and Latin America. The BRICS. The China Plus 16, which is a forum for discussion between China and 16 countries in Europe, mainly Central and Eastern Europe. So also this political multilateralism around China is going well. We have economic, in the sense of financial multilateralism, with the new Asian and Infrastructure Development Bank, with the new Development Bank. we also have new multilateral trade agreements where China is somehow the leading actor behind the curtains, like the new comprehensive agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership, and like the new RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership between the 10 ASEAN countries, plus China, plus Japan, plus South Korea, plus Australia, and plus New Zealand. So in this sense, multilateralism is alive. There is also another dimension that we can look at to understand where regionalism is going. All the newcomers, the so-called emerging powers, are not actually criticizing the very idea of multilateralism. So they are not against normative multilateralism, but they are against procedural multilateralism. They don't want to be excluded from making the rules that govern our world. So it really depends on how you look at it. Second aspect that you mentioned in your question is, in a way, the question of polarity. So do we live in a multipolar world with a plurality of actors, that is the United States, China, the European Union, other emerging powers such as India, such as South Korea, Brazil, Mexico? If you want, you can add to the list freely. But there are also other ways to look at this. For instance, are we really sure that the very concept of polarity is still up to date and fit to explain our world? Because yes, you can say, well, it's multipolar, or maybe we're going back to bipolarity, where the future will be decided by China and the United States. But that would be a different bipolarity from the one we already know, because the Soviet Union was not integrated in economics terms, neither with developing countries, nor, and most of all, nor with its strategic rival, the United States. But China is. China is economically dependent on the United States, on its strategic rival. It is economically interconnected with the European Union and also with developing countries in Africa, in Latin America. By the way, China has a very strong relation with the Gulf countries, where it imports most of its oil from. So all this story that China is conquering Africa for oil, it's simply not true if you look at the data. China gets most of its oil from the Middle East, partly from Africa and partly from Latin America. So China is also strategic interest. So if you want to talk about bipolarity, this is a very different bipolarity from the one we had during the Cold War. But we can also think of a sort of interpolarity, where the poles are not state actors, but we have other actors. Think of transnational civil society. These days, the movement for the rights of women, this is transnational. And this has nothing to do with COVID. This has nothing to do with superpowers competition. Again, transnational civil society advocating better access to education, better access to health services, more equality everywhere, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, even in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, this has nothing to do with superpower competition. So how do we understand polarity? And I think that already with this, there is a lot to think about. Final dimension I want to add to this dialogue is, what do we look at? Because I mean, where do we have competition? We have competition everywhere. But there are areas, for instance, take the environment. Even if you have nuclear power, you cannot drop a nuclear bomb on a country to force it to go for a Green Deal. That's simply not possible. So power is not necessarily fungible. There are areas in which power alone is not enough. You need not really power over someone, but power to convince someone, to persuade someone to cooperate. That is true for the pandemic. That is true for technological disruption. That is true for the environment. That is true for nuclear proliferation. So when we talk about this superpower competition, that is somehow the third component of your question, Sarah. I think it really depends on what you look at. If you look at in terms of military spending and military capability, the United States remain the sole superpower, the only superpower. Its military capacity far exceeds the capacity of China. However, today, it's enough to have enough technological capacity to disrupt the electronic system governing all nuclear weapons in the United States to render that nuclear power void and useless. And who has technological power today? Essentially two countries, China and the United States. China and the US account for over 75% of the big patents that are released in the most technologically advanced sectors, for over 50% of investment in innovation and technology globally. But what if you think about, for instance, green power, the environment, and green technology? Well, again, you have to be very careful and look at the specifics of the areas you're talking about. Take, for instance, renewable energy. Who is a champion in renewable energy? Well, the answer is, it depends. If you look at solar power, 7 of the top 10 world leading producers come from China. So China is definitely the leader. But if you look at wind power energy, then you will find out that among the top 10 producers, you have at least 4 different geographical leaders. That is the United States, that is the European Union, that is China, and that is India too, not to mention Norway itself. So we should really be very careful. The world in which we live in today is not only in a phase of transition, is not only in a phase of uncertainty, very pervasive uncertainty, but it's extremely complex and multifaceted. So this world does not lend itself easily to any sort of generalization.
Thank you very much. I know that was a big question with a very difficult answer, but thank you anyway. I will now urge people to start dropping some questions in the chat. You can send them to everyone. And I will ask you one last question, a more broad one, if possible. In your opinion, what is the most important aspect that COVID-19 will change in international relations?
That's really a difficult one. You really enjoy making my life difficult this evening. Well, again, it's very difficult to make prediction, but in my view, the most important and long-lasting impact will be in the way we think about ourselves. We have already moved to a different way of thinking. I mean, just think of how we interact. So we're now interacting via an electronic platform. This business has incredibly boomed. So even when you say, well, the economic consequences of COVID-19 will be the most important factor, yes, maybe you're right. But you cannot, again, generalize, because some companies and some sectors will actually greatly benefit from this pandemic. And then one can say, yes, but in terms of superpower competition, maybe China has already defeated COVID. They report very few cases. It's a dictatorship. They can impose discipline. Yes. However, have you noticed that all the platforms we use to communicate these days come from the United States? So China may have got some advantage, but tell me which one? Because in fact, Zoom is from the US, Google Meet, Google from the US, WebEx, Cisco System, California, United States. Which one do I miss? Microsoft Teams. Microsoft, again, United States. So I don't think that the economic legacy per se will be the biggest impact of COVID. But really, we started thinking differently. I'm not quite sure that this is only the result of COVID, but think, for instance, of how we think about the environment. After 1 week of lockdown in China and in Europe, pollution had gone down very significantly in China. In fact, you could actually see China from the space. So you didn't only see a sort of grayish cloud, but you could see Chinese territory. Think of Italy, 1 week of lockdown, there was again fish in the Venice lagoon, and you could see the bottom of the Venice canals. So the way in which we think has really changed, because we cannot go or we cannot afford other lockdowns just in favor of the environment. But we have certainly understood that there is a middle way between the way in which we used to live and the full lockdown. Perhaps technology is the solution, perhaps changing our habits is the solution. So I definitely think that the long-lasting impact will be the way in which we think, not necessarily the way in which we behave, because human beings have a very short memory. So you can be sure when the emergency is gone, probably 2 or 3 weeks later, we will be already in the streets, we will not be wearing masks, and so on and so forth. For those of you who love football, I mean, we are all sad that Mr. Maradona passed away, but this is no justification to allow thousands and thousands of people to get together in Naples, which is still a red zone in Italy. This is incredible. So in terms of behavior and impact on behavior, I don't think that COVID-19 will change us significantly. But yes, it will change the way in which we reflect upon this kind of thing. So I would expect change not to be abrupt and radical, but to be incremental and functional. So we will start changing the way we think in specific functional areas, probably in several specific functional areas. And as a result, function plus function plus function plus function will result in a more generalized or more perceptible kind of change at the international level.
Thank you very much. So I will now ask the first question that we see in the chat from Michaela, and she asks, do you believe that once we have a vaccine, that will accentuate the disparities between countries?
Well, that very much depends on how we will produce and distribute the vaccine. It looks like the first hints are quite positive, especially from Europe. I am a very proud European and member of the European Union. I proud myself with being a citizen of the European Union. And the European Union has already formalized a commitment to buy doses of the vaccine also for those countries or those regions of the world that will not necessarily be able to buy it. I also expect a multilateral commitment that somehow engages the private sector into public behavior. That means I would expect that competition in the private sector, for instance, we have at least 5 or 6 different producers, different scientific teams that claim that they are experimenting already in phase 3. So it's not possible that one company only will see the value of their share booming. By increasing competition, in fact, we will minimize the advantage for those who want to run alone, and we will somehow increase the incentives for those who want to cooperate. That's I would say it's more my hope than my belief, to be honest, to answer Michaela's question.
Thank you. And now a question from Diogo. Do you think that the chaotic response of the US and other Western countries further undermined the Western model as a soft power tool, which was already in crisis?
Yes, unfortunately, I think that this will be the case. I mean, there is a lot of expectation surrounding Mr. Biden, but don't forget that Trump will not disappear, probably, and in any case, Trumpism will not disappear. So the protectionist tensions, the America First mentality will not vanish overnight. And in fact, we don't know what will happen in 4 years. Maybe in 4 years, we will have another Trump or Trump again. So I would not try, if I were any serious analyst, to project forecasts beyond a 4, maximum 5-year period. So I will stay within the medium period. However, that said, it's certain that the US has lost a lot of prestige around the world. I'm not quite sure about the European Union, but the European Union has one big problem. That is its very poor communication strategy. The European Union does a lot of good, please. It's not a bad institution. On the contrary, it's a great institution that works really well considering the structural limitation, how to bring together 27 member states. It's not easy. But the EU should really invest on its communication strategy inside the Union and outside the Union. So it is possible that China will get away with a sort of better positioning. However, let's see what happens if a good number of states can form a coalition to investigate how the virus actually was formed and how the virus actually spread and what the real responsibilities of China or someone else's are. That is still in the making. For the time being, it looks like China may take some advantage, although it's not necessarily the case.
All right, and on the hot topic of China, Tomas would like to know, how will a more regional globalization affect China, given that it is not very popular amongst its Southern Asian neighbors?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Tomas. I think that China is perhaps not very popular. However, China is becoming more and more popular, either because China is actually improving its policies towards its neighbors. There is a charm offensive that the Beijing government has been conducting towards its neighbors for the last few years. But there is also another dimension to consider. That is, as you may know, cooperation and regionalism is part of what we define cooperation in IR, may have a defensive nature. So one can cooperate also to defend itself from a more aggressive partner. In this sense, the signature of the RCEP agreement, involving China together with the ASEAN countries and also Japan, and also South Korea, and also Australia, and also New Zealand shows very clearly one thing, that the broader neighborhood of China is getting closer and closer to China, at least in economic terms. And by the way, the Trump administration invested a lot on the Indo-Pacific defensive system to contain China strategically. But for the time being, the only country in the area that has stuck to this idea is Modi's India. Because Australia, New Zealand, that are traditionally close allies of the United States, Japan and South Korea, that are historically the cornerstone of Southeast Asian security policy of Washington, have actually signed the RCEP agreement. So there is perhaps a divergence here between security and strategic visions and economic interest, which reminds us that in international relations, more often than not, interests are not mutually exclusive. I can do business with you, but I can do strategic alliances with someone else to contain you, even if we do trade together. However, to wrap up, I think that China is gaining something, is gaining ground, also in terms of charm, soft power, and image, especially in its broader neighborhood and not only the immediate neighborhood.
All right, indeed, a very hairy question. So Ari is asking, how has the pandemic affected the relations between EU countries? And has the shorter supply lines affect the EU's economic cooperation?
Thank you. Again, wow, you're really asking challenging question. So again, I think we should distinguish what are phenomena that were already taking place before COVID-19 and what COVID-19 and the pandemic may have reinforced, generated, maybe changed. So there is a quite clear Germanization of Europe in economic and political terms. Germany is clearly the driver of the European Union, with good piece of Mr. Macron and the French, who still live under the delusion that they count a lot, but they don't. The only country that really counts in Europe this day in terms of leadership or in terms of role as a primus inter pares is Germany, which is not an hegemon, but the concept of Kern Europe, that is the core of Europe, hinges around a German strategic views. Which countries are actually subservient to the German economy? That is, which countries buy more from Germany than from other strategic rivals, say China or the United States. These are basically all countries in Europe with just a few exceptions. So Europe is becoming more and more German. That said, how does this impact European unity or European intra-relations during and after COVID? Well, first of all, the idea of a recovery fund was not Macron's idea, but was Merkel's idea, which was generously shared with Macron, because Macron was the leader who most insisted with the Germans, together with the Spaniards, the Italians, and the Greeks, but it was essentially France that needed a communitarization of the economic response. And Germany agreed to that. Who is now putting pressure on Hungary and Poland to approve the EU budget and so allowing the next generation EU to function, it's again Germany. Of course, with the support of all other countries, there is diplomatic effort. But certainly Germany is the country that is now somehow moving the threads of European politics and policies. And there is nothing wrong with that. Not just because I'm based in Germany, but because it's a natural kind of development. Okay. A different thing is now to say, but is Europe more or less united? I think that Europe is more united than before. But again, it is unable to communicate it. I mean, just look at what happened at the very beginning of the pandemic. Everybody was criticizing the EU because of the closure of borders. But that does not depend on the EU. The treaty establishing Schengen gives member states the option to shut down borders in case of pandemic. And there is nothing that the European Union, the Commission, the Council, or the Parliament can do about it. This is European law. It's not the weakness of the European Union. The same happened. Why there was no common health response? Well, because the European Union has no primary responsibility for health policy. This falls under the primary competence of member states. So you cannot ask the Union to do what member states legally are supposed to do. The legal argument aside, the European Union showed a lot of solidarity and a lot of unity. Think of the times of politics and policy making, always very long. Well, the European Union approved its first aid package only 3 days after the first country in Europe declared the lockdown. That was Italy. And well before France declared lockdown and Germany adopted not a full lockdown, but very restrictive measures. So the European Union was quicker than anybody else to react. That means there was agreement not only within the Commission, which, please remember, is composed from commissioners of different member states, but also within the Council of the European Union, where member states do have a say. So I personally think that this tragedy of COVID-19 shows that Europe is more united and not more divided. Differences are normal, but the European regional response has been so far the only unitary regional response on the planet.
All right, thank you very much. So I will now take on the 3 questions that are in the chat, and I'm afraid that's all we'll have time for today. So first up, we have Katerina, who is asking, in what extent hiding the virus in the beginning of the pandemic affected China's image in the international system? And a subsequent question, can we assume that COVID had a worse impact in the US economy than in China's economy?
Yeah. Okay, well, China in economic terms does not seem to suffer as much as other areas of the world. In fact, China has increased in July 2020 the amount of its import as compared to July 2019 from a number of countries. So that says a lot. The way to recovery will be probably faster in China. But don't forget that also China is a bloody dictatorship. I cannot stand when people give me China as a good example of management, because it's very easy to impose things without a debate. I mean, it's much more difficult to convince, if I could convince all of you tonight to go for dinner and eat what I want, I have to convince you. A different thing is if I have the power to impose fish on everybody or meat also on vegan and vegetarian people. That's what China is about. China is a dictatorship. So China is not a good example. I refuse to think in this kind of category. South Korea, for instance, is a democracy. Australia and New Zealand are democracies, and they responded equally well and equally fast to the COVID-19 tragedy. So I would temper the kind of enthusiasm for economic recovery with the concern for the political situation.
All right. Thank you. I would circle back really quickly to the impact of China, its image for other countries in their international system. Do you believe that that will impact in any way, or it's just one of those press cycles that will go away?
Yeah, we have already briefly touched upon this. I mean, it's very easy to say how this thing will unravel in the middle and in the long term. For the time being, Chinese soft power and Chinese diplomacy were able to counter the effect of a very bad management at the beginning of this pandemic. But that's the case now. What will happen in 1 year, 2 years? Who knows? Let's see also what happens with the vaccine. That's also quite important variable.
Yes, thank you. All right, Mariana would like to know if you consider that the education system will change in any way in the EU, and if that happens, do you expect it to transpire to other countries?
Well, again, I repeat myself, this has happened even before COVID-19. You may remember that the European Commission proposed a very ambitious budget for education, for Erasmus Plus, for instance. The Council did not agree in the first instance and proposed a compromise. And then the European Parliament stepped in to support the initial proposal by the Commission, which would make about 20 billion euros available for education, which is a lot. It's a big leap forward as compared to the previous budget. I understand from sources from the European Commission, I actually had a meeting with them yesterday, that in the next week or two, an agreement should be reached. And this agreement should be very close to the initial proposal of the Commission. If that were the case, that would mean a big boost in terms of spending on education and research. How the money will be used, God knows. European program, we know, will be strengthened. How member states will use the next generation EU and the new budgetary line available to reform their own system, we don't know. Probably there will be a strengthening of the digitalization infrastructure. That's quite probable.
All right, a very last question from Barbara. How can Latin American countries forge a people-centered approach rather than an economically centered one towards a sustainable development after COVID-19?
I love this question, Barbara. Thank you very much for it. I'm afraid I don't have an answer. I mean, this has been a problem in Latin America for at least the last 500 years, if not before. Don't forget that the Incas were as conquerors in Latin America as the Europeans were. So the problem of dependency on external powers is not something that started with Columbus. We should also get rid of this kind of myth and stereotypes. There are recent studies that demonstrate that. But how can we have a people-centered approach? That requires a big change of mentality. And perhaps we're getting there. I'll give you two positive hints. The first, between 1991 and 2010, almost, I think, the numbers of Latin American students enrolled in tertiary higher education has doubled. So these people should now enter the labor market, enter institution, enter the economy, enter politics. They should bring better idea and better productivity. So that's one positive path. The second positive path is that the business sector in Latin America is changing very much. it is not just in the hands of few and the usual few elites, but more and more young businessmen have a social vision for Latin America. And I can tell you that by first-hand experience in 2018, I was in Lima for the Pacific Alliance Business Summit. And I can promise there were a lot of interesting ideas and discussions that show a lot of concern for Latin American people and society, which means that the economy should be a tool, an instrument to improve the life of people and not the other way around. So let's hope that these two glimpses of hope actually do materialize into something tangible and concrete.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. So I think we're about ready to close down this very insightful webinar. I will now have to pass on to the marketing strategy of inviting everyone to go meet our network and the work we do on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. We have it all. And thank you again for all your insightful ideas. And we cannot stress enough how grateful we are for your presence.
Thank you very much. It was really my pleasure. Count on my support, and best of luck to you as association and to you all for your interest and studies in IR, international politics, and for your future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being present. I hope you have a pleasant weekend, and yes, thank you.
Bye bye everybody. Até mais. Ciao.
Bye.